Greetings, friends. This is Ian McKenzie here, and I'm honored to share a special conversation with you with Minna Salami, an author, social critic, and senior fellow at the New Institute. Now, our exchange was recorded during the Fugitive Futures Summit that I co-hosted back in February 2025. I'm sharing it here because of the powerful resonance between Minna's work and the questions that I often explore here on this podcast. Minna's book, Sensuous Knowledge, a Black Feminist Approach for Everyone, proposes a liberatory way of knowing that's embodied, relational, and rooted in both thought and feeling. Drawing upon African cosmologies and feminist philosophy, Minna challenges the dominance of Euro-patriarchal systems and invites us toward a more holistic worldview. In our conversation, we explore this sensuous way of knowing and its deep relevance to masculinity. We speak to the adolescent forms of masculine power so common in leadership today, and we ask how a more mature, rooted masculinity might emerge through depth and inner listening. So, take a breath, settle in, and let this conversation work on you. Good morning, good evening, Minna. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Ian. It's really wonderful to be here. I remember you invited me for your summit last year, but unfortunately I wasn't well then and I couldn't join. So very glad that I could make it this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I trust the timing, the emergence, the intelligence.
Yes.
And I'd love to dive right in. Again, I feel like at least in your book that we named the one that you've already published, Sensuous Knowledge. I mean, there's something very, it's like when two words come together and then they immediately have this like creative generative tension between them, that there's something mysterious and potent about that. And so I'd just love to start there and some of the foundations around that. What is sensuous knowledge and why is it important for the times that we're in?
Sensuous knowledge is, and thank you for the question and also for the mentioning this kind of fusion of words, and that it, I guess, struck something for you, which is also what it did for me before I started writing the book. So maybe the best way to explain what I'm trying to describe is that sensuous knowledge is in many ways the way that I perceive the world and the way that I live and the way that I do my work as a social critic and as a feminist, and how I approach these two kind of facets of both my personal and professional existence. And the way that I perceive the world could also be described as a pluralist, non-dualist, multi-perspectival way, which emanates to a great extent from my background and my kind of biological context, which is that I am of mixed ethnicities. I come from Finland and Nigeria, two very, some might say, polar opposites of cultures, although actually being an embodiment of the two, I've come to see that there are many more similarities than people might assume. I have lived in many places in this crazy planet of ours. I grew up in Nigeria, lived in Sweden for over a decade. I've lived in London for over 20 years, lived in New York for quite many years, lived in Spain. I speak many languages. I'm currently living in Germany, forgot to mention that, where I've been for over 2 years, and grew up in an interfaith household as well. My father is Muslim, my mother Protestant, if not practicing as such. And I also grew up in a kind of what is called in the Yoruba language, which is my ethnic group in Nigeria, an agboile, which is it means, roughly translated, a family compound. So even though we had our own separate flat, our separate home, it was part of a compound where many of my aunties and uncles and cousins lived, and they all had also different religions and languages and just ways of being. And so my entire kind of existence has been one which was informed by diversity, to use a contemporary lingo, and because of that, I kind of I never had like a clear sense of direction. I never had a clear path that had been carved out for me in the way that many people, at least of my generation, had. I think these days, thanks to the internet and social media and just globalization, people maybe do feel that they have many more possible directions and paths that they can choose in life. But back then, certainly, most people around me had a very clear sense of like, this is who I am, where I'm from, I belong in so-and-so community, and most likely my life is going to be headed in such and such direction because of these contexts. I never felt that that was an option for me. I always was very aware that I needed to forge my own path. And this is where, I started out by saying that my multi-perspectival approach to life, to existence, to work, which I've dubbed sensuous knowledge, is partly due to like these kind of material realities and circumstances. But this thing of feeling and having an awareness of needing to forge one's own path, I think extends beyond the material and has something to do with a metaphysical or even a spiritual disposition, which, we can talk about, like, are we, do we have some kind of destiny? In the Yoruba culture, we believe that we do, that one has a kind of purpose, at least, if not destiny. And I think that was one of mine. So I've always been someone who hated conformity and felt a need to rise to this task that I had been given, I guess, of like finding my own way, but of course being informed by all of these different perspectives that I had. So I'm saying all this to say that I've been living what I then came to refer to as sensuous knowledge since the moment I was born, in a sense. And so what sensuous knowledge is a kind of synthesizing approach to life. So moving away from conformity, and conformity can take shape and does take shape to great measure in our society as a binary way of thinking, because that sort of takes away our options. We think that we have to choose one way, we have to choose one political system, we have to choose one gender, we have to choose one profession, all of these very reductive binary choices. And so what I'm describing with sensuous knowledge is a non-dualist way of being instead, and seeing that there's always a more kaleidoscopic reality in which we are ensconced. Did you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I catch all that. Yeah, I just I zoom in on you as you offer your responses, just for folks too. It's kind of more engaging, I guess, but sometimes it can be tricky if you're like, where'd I go?
That's what I felt. And I was like, am I talking to someone? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely heard everything. And as we dive deeper into this, a phrase came to me that I studied for many years with one of our other elders who was here earlier in the session or previous session, which Stephen Jenkinson. But he had this line where he said something one time, and it's coming to me now, and I'm just curious how this might fit with what you're saying, where he said, your manner of approach to something, to inquiry, to relationship, your manner of approach will dictate that, not that you will find what you're looking for, but you'll find your way of looking. Right? There's something like that I'm hearing. And also this question of epistemology as ways of knowing, which I understand that's the word, that's how I understand it, right? How do we know how we know? Ways of knowing. And so for me, I hear in what you're saying that if we look at or juxtapose the, what was characterized as sort of Euro, binary patriarchal systems of approach to the world, right? And to systems, to the living intelligence, you'll find your way of looking even though you think you're finding what might be objectively how it is. And so I hear in what you're saying, I think with sensuous knowledge is that that's a different manner of approach. That is kind of what I'm translating, and I wonder if you might speak to that. What is that manner of approach, and how does that juxtapose with the overculture's, again, Eurocentric way of understanding?
I like that you'll find your way of looking. I think it resonates with me in multiple ways, such that I think quite often, because we live in such a sort of techno-solutionist binary world, we are always, our impulse is to try and identify the problem so that we can then solve it. Identify a new paradigm or a new prism, and then kind of forgetting that the thing, like the answer lies in how we are perceiving things, and really like getting a sense of clarity about oneself and about society at large, and through that kind of starting to tend to the traumas and the hurts and the problems. I mean, just to finish, to conclude, and maybe try to describe sensuous knowledge in a more practical or material sense. It's what I tend to describe this story, which is the creation myth from the Yorubas. And in the Yoruba creation myth, the notion of knowledge was and is a deity. And there's a story that when the gods, the larger gods, the supreme gods, gave knowledge to the Yoruba people, they gave, so knowledge in Yoruba is called ogbon, and they gave ogbon to the people, but split it into two. So saying that there was something called ogbon ori and something called ogbon inu, which kind of literally translate as knowledge of the head and knowledge of the gut, but in a kind of Western context, or in English phraseology, we might call this emotional intelligence and rational thinking. And in the Yoruba creation myth, these two elements, these two sides of knowledge, were given to the people because there was a deep understanding that to only embody one of these, whether as an individual or as the community, the social organism at large, was to only be part wise. And so one of these other facets of my growing up in Nigeria and Africa, and with this kind of energy, this knowledge surrounding me, even though, of course, Nigeria was a country that was a colonial invention in the first place. And so therefore the atmosphere was colonized, and these kind of more indigenous knowledge systems were not the dominant ones. So I don't want to imply that, but the spirit of them was and is still very, very much alive. And I think that also really always informed me. And if I were to try to describe sensuous knowledge with a story, then that would be the one. And that is the one that I start my book Sensuous Knowledge with, because it so well describes that the ways in which knowledge is much more kaleidoscopic than we think, and also that we are the sort of more conventional and dominant way of knowing, or the dominant epistemology, which I refer to as Euro-patriarchal knowledge, is one that does encourage us to only be part wise, because it kind of insists on this binary, hierarchical, categorizing way of understanding ourselves and our world.
Thank you for that. It makes me think, and again, this is just a parallel example. I'm not sure if you've seen the film The Village of Lovers yet, which is the Tamara film. Yeah, which is okay. But they have a whole area dedicated in the community, which they call Terra Deva. And it's essentially their practice of connecting with the animate forces on the land, and to build relation. And in that sense, like, to me, that's a very different kind of relational building, versus what you've just described of the Euro categorized hierarchical way of understanding. And for me, I guess what I'm surmising, of course, that we don't have to look around to say, what happens if people only have one kind of knowledge system that tends to be more rational, hierarchical? Like, you don't have to wonder about it, because I think that's kind of what we see now, like that as the dominant. And so I'd love for you to say, so what is the consequence of that, maybe in your understanding of basically only having that one way of understanding the world? How has that perhaps kind of dead-ended the way of trying to grapple with the uncertainty of the times? Because the theme of this day, of course, also is emerge. And emergence as a phenomenon, my understanding of it is, again, how complexity can arise from simplicity. Or you could say, like, a complex order arises from a kind of simple interactions of, like, basic building blocks. That's one understanding, but I'd love for your take of how does a sensuous knowledge lead to a capacity to be in relationship with an emergent intelligence, if you could.
Lots to unpack there. I mean, I think first of all, like you said, where does Euro-patriarchal knowledge take us to? And it takes us to exactly where we are. We are living in the belly of the beast of Euro-patriarchal knowledge, and there's, we are, of course, there are many ways to define our times. Some people are calling it a polycrisis. Certainly there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of suffering, and also a whole lot of confusion. And I think that's one of the very, kind of ironical and fascinating things about Euro-patriarchal knowledge, that it positions itself and it positions rationality and reason so highly, and yet what it ends up creating is utter confusion. And the reason for that is because reality is not something that we can understand only rationally. There is a mystical component to nature, which is what we all are, and there's a mystical component to each of our individual lives, and let alone the social organism that we create and we refer to as cities or families or countries and continents, and we've been repressing that mystical component for so many centuries that we have now arrived at a place where we don't even know how to tend to that anymore, really. I think we don't know how to approach it fully. And we are certainly making attempts. I think we are living in an era where, probably because there is this sort of heightened awareness of how fucked we are, basically. And there's a heightened awareness due, I think, to like social media and globalization. Because when I think about emergence, I think the word is used in a more positive way than what it brings up for me, which is what I think what is emerging, and what is emerging is not necessarily something that I desire to emerge. And I had a quick look at the etymology of the word, and at least for the word merge, it comes from plunging, and I found that really interesting, because that's exactly what comes up for me when I hear emerge. It's like this feeling that we need to really awake. We need a cold shower of sorts, because there is so much confusion, and so and that confusion coming from this heightened awareness of the mess that we're in, but it nevertheless sort of requires a way to step back, and I really love how much more there's conversations around things like slowness, and even mysticism and spirituality these days, because these are ways for us to take a step back a little bit, and to try to discover what tools can help us what move away from this desperate state of confusion. Yeah.
I love that, actually. If I could just offer maybe a reflection, I think a piece too, in how you described a kind of I see this knowledge system that imposes, right, an order, and then believes that the order is true. Like I see that in this kind of, the Eurocentric understanding that you're talking about, this categorization, this definition. In some sense, it feels it's comforting in a way if someone is trying to impose order, right? Like, oh, it's too confusing, so I'm just going to impose. And I'm thinking of the very recent Trump being, in office, and one of his executive orders, I understand, was, I'm based in Canada, right? So we see it all up here. But one of the executive orders was, there's only two genders, right? The government is only going to recognize two genders, right? You can just feel this, like, boom, this is what it is. And on the one hand, I get that, like, from the familiarity of, like, that'll simplify everything, right? So everybody who thinks, otherwise, this is the way it is. And for me, that's it's a deep violence, it feels like, towards the mystical component and the fluidity and the possibility that emerges when there's not this need to impose, right? To impose a false order, a false categorization on something that actually has much more layered textures of ways of knowing, ways of like illuminating the prismatic nature of, like, what is gender, and, like, how do we live these archetypal dynamics? Like, all of that stuff just kind of, right, gets put aside when it's like, this is the way it is. And I feel like that's the function of that imposition, right? Is to kind of try to tame the mystical, right? And the problem of that, or like the loss of that, it's more like a tragedy, of course, right? Of the tragedy of, like, that means you're cutting out all these other ways of understanding and knowing and being in relationship and possibility and intelligence. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm seeing. Yeah. And so I just so appreciate you're saying, like, hey, look, this is your way of seeking is going to banish so much else, I feel, that is there. So yeah, I mean, I'd love for you to.
That's just perfect example. And I sometimes say that we don't live in a patriarchy as such. We live in a boyarchy, because a lot of the powers, the institutions of power are actually governed and driven by something that is a very immature, boyish way of thinking, rather than a patriarch. Because something about the patriarchal archetype is actually quite grandfatherly, which means there can be a wisdom to that,
Sure.
whereas what we're getting with Trump and all these oligarchs, it's this very, like, childish archetype, and this new policy, law, whatever they're calling it, of, like, oh, there's only two genders, which is just absolutely shockingly insane that is being imposed and violent, not only to the mystical component, but to people, like to all these people who don't ascribe to there being two genders. But it's insofar that it comes from a desire to simplify, and that desire comes from a place of pain, because I think we do need to start trying to understand the other a little bit more, no matter which side of the spectrum we're on. And, like, understanding that the other is operating from a place of fear and pain and all of these human quarrels, because we're all in this messy, confusing time together. And insofar that these folks are, like, can't deal with complexity, can't deal with diversity, because they just want to retort back to their cozy little binary world. It is so childlike, and Euro-patriarchal knowledge is so immature in that sense, because it's okay to think that way when you're a child. It's okay to seek comfort in simplicity, and even as an adult, at times we all need to do that, and we need some things that are set for us, and everything cannot be completely unpredictable and unknown, because that would we'd probably go mad. That might in fact be a definition of madness. But when especially in societies that are as complex as ours, and even, whatever kinds of societies, the stage of maturity implies that one finds a way to assess the many nuances of reality in a way that does as little harm as possible, and in a way that elucidates as much of that cosmic complexity as possible. And this kind of imposition and insistence on reducing things, what I think first and foremost when I hear these things is like, how can decision makers, how can adults who have had some of the best education in this world, people who are so privileged, how can they insist on looking at the world in such a childlike manner? Where are the mature people? where yeah. So absolutely on point.
Yeah. Well, thanks for this. And I want to bind it now too to the sensuous knowledge as I'm imagining a kind of like supple capacity to be in complexity. And so I wonder for you, like, what is the skill set of that capacity to be in, again, this, because it almost seems like there's the element of the trickster there as well, right? Like in the time of the trickster almost as the antidote to the heroic certainty, right? As often a lot of mythology have these qualities, right? This upending nature of the trickster can come in and just, play with all those binaries, between. And so in that sense, I'm curious how the embodied skill set, right, of being able to move with uncertainty is different than, of course, like clinging with terror, right, to the dissolution of so many things, and also this not falling prey to the impulse to try to impose order once again, right? Because again, there's a safety there, or can be a perceived safety, but it feels like there's a different invitation being asked, stepping into, right, this immersive new possibility of something. So again, I'd love to hear your sense of like how to move in that kind of understanding.
Thank you. Yeah, in my forthcoming book, I have a chapter that's called "The Trickster Dualism," and I'm resonating a lot with what you just said, because there is certainly the sensibility of the trickster is one that I think we ought to tap into. And of course, our dear brother Bayo Akomolafe is a huge inspiration for me and for many of us. I know he was also one of the speakers here, and he talks a lot about the trickster. He's also from the Yoruba ethnic group, and we have a deity also for the trickster called Eshu. But in my book, I argue that the observer and the observed is the trickster, is a kind of trickster dualism, and one which helps us to think through a lot of these kinds of a lot of the societal problems that we're having, because on the surface it seems like any other dualism, like it seems like the self and the other, for example, which is truly a dualism, but the observer and the observed is not actually a dualism in the end, because we, within each of ourselves, within every observer, there's also an observed, and vice versa. But anyway, that's something that I get into in the book. But I think in terms of like sensuous knowledge and the invitation that it's offering is maybe something along, and I should say that it's like the book and the concept is sort of the tip of the iceberg, as I see it. It's it is something truly that one experiences, one lives, and that is how I practice it. And I say that to preface that what I'm saying is not a prescription, or what I'm about to say, but it's a sensibility perhaps of the polymath, rather than the expert. It's the poet rather than the reporter, or the artist rather than the scientist, which is not to say that experts or scientists or reporters are not, archetypes or professions that we need and should desire in a well-functioning society. But and because we also, of course, have people who embody multiplicity, like nobody is strictly just one thing, like a scientist also appreciates art and so on. But yes, it's that kind of polymathic sensibility of being. The polymath is, an archetype that I think is curious about understanding the world as a whole and not just being like that. Whereas the expert is, this is my niche thing and this is all that I'm focusing on, and I'm going to explain everything else through this very niche and narrow way of looking at the world. And the polymath is like the explosion from the outside, like it's just everything is interesting, and trying to make synthesizing connections between things as well. And because it's interesting, on the one hand there's the Trumpists and the people who really want the binaries, the very simple formats. But I think even in more progressive circles, there's we also find it so hard to step out of this kind of dualistic way of thinking. And one of the notions that has come up to kind of, it does this weird dance of like claiming to step away from binary thinking, but yet I find it's very much influenced by it, and that's interdisciplinarity. So this is like a very popular notion right now, and people see that as a way of moving out of binary thinking. And it is, I definitely don't mean to sort of dismiss it in a categorical way, because a lot of really beautiful and important work gets done under the banner of interdisciplinarity, but it's still obviously so focused on the idea of disciplines, which is a very Euro-patriarchal idea, and not a way that the polymath, again, to go back to that sensibility, might try to look at the world. It's so what I'm saying with sensuous knowledge is, fuck disciplines and just it's be kaleidoscopic in your thinking. See the mysticals, but also see the scientific, if you like. Just to finish and riff off this idea of the kaleidoscopic, because kaleidoscopes are the perfect symbol, I think, for sensuous knowledge, if I had to choose one, because it is in some sense a kaleidoscope, of course, is the first thing that we think, and that I mean when I use that word, is the kind of enchantment, and the ways in which whatever you point a kaleidoscope at, it shifts according to that, and it's beautiful, and it's it stirs us in an almost magical way. But at the same time, a kaleidoscope is, it's a very simply scientifically describable object. You take a tube, you break some glass and add some color, and so there's actually the magic of it can be broken down quite simply into scientific empirical facts, and that's precisely what I'm trying to conjure with sensuous knowledge. Is like this. It's not one or the other, because we're trying to move away from binaries, but it's precisely this mix of worlds and genres and disciplines.
Yeah, I so love that. And I guess what I'm imagining as well, like, let's say my son, right? He's 6, and if he asks me, as he often does, right, questions about things, right? Like, why is the moon up there? Right. And I could say, well, it's the gravity and the, the distance from Earth. And, I could explain it with that lens and it'd be accurate in a way. Right. But that way of approaching immediately banishes any of the, I would say, the mystical, right, the relational sense that there's an aliveness present. And if I said to him too, well, the moon longs for the Earth, right, and has longed for since ancient times, right, and gets ever closer, shining a light. And like, again, that I would almost call it a mythopoetic understanding, right, as well, like just what that does, right, what the function of it. And some might say, well, that's it's romanticizing and it's not true, it's not, but then again, what is the function of banishing all mystery and animate intelligence, right, through this other lens? Is, I think that, again, this is where we are. This is where we've got us. Like, what's the consequence of proceeding as if the Earth is just stuff and not alive, and other beings don't have their own agency and intelligence, right? So I see from you reconstituting through the different lens, like illuminates, like you say, a kaleidoscopic a sense of possibilities. And I think this is where again, opening with Emerge Day as well is this invitation that we're having for folks, of course, listening, and I think through your work and to others who are trying to, offer, like we can't proceed differently with like blinders of a certain way of seeing and approaching both the crises right at hand, and not understanding how we got here. One of the questions or insights from previous conversations, I can't remember who said it right now, but it was something like a problem half understood is already solved, or halfway solved, something like that, right? Half understand a problem and you're halfway there to solving it, well understood. And so I guess this is the question, right? To see our way of seeing is how we either continue on, what we've done, or proceed differently. And I hear you bringing in other knowledge systems, other ways of understanding. And we got about 10 minutes too. And I'd love to ask this question around, so it's sensuous, right? And that's a very particular word, because to me, I think sensual, and I think the senses. And in Tamara, they have also a parallel, I think, understanding of the erotic or eros, right? As the intelligence of life. And they include sexual love within that understanding of eros, but that it's so much more than that, right? It's this much vaster understanding of the world. And so I wonder for you, like, how do you distinguish sensuous ways of knowing, right? Like, and again, I understand we're kind of like asking from an irrational intellectual perspective of how do you express something deeply embodied and relational and sensual? But like, what is that in the component of what you're trying to invite folks into, right? The quality of the sensual, the sensuous, the erotic within that way of knowing.
Yeah. So the way that I think about the notion of sensuousness is that it includes also sensuality. So I'm not rejecting the idea of it could also be sensual knowledge in some sense, but I think like sensuality has so much more to do with bodily pleasure than what I'm connoting with sensuous knowledge. And to be honest, as I mentioned in the beginning, like this phrase sensuous knowledge just appeared in a sense to me and said, and I immediately when it came to mind, knew that it was going to be the title of the book that I had already started to mull over, and that was going to describe this perspective, this multi-perspectival way of approaching existence that I have, and then I had to go and myself sort of ask this question you're asking now. Is like, why sensuous? Why not sensual? What is even the word sensuous? Why does it exist? Like, what makes it different from sensual? And I found, I mean, it's, first of all, there's quite like a lot of debates about this. And actually, I also found that Karl Marx, of all people, also wrote about what he called sensuous knowledge. But what the description that I like the most, and the one that I'm alluding to also in my book, is by John Milton, who actually coined the word sensuous. And he coined it because he was trying to describe his genre, poetry, and he felt that sensual didn't quite cut it, like, because it was more about pleasure. And obviously rationality wasn't the word, and all of these other options. And so he coined sensuous to describe, I mean, I think something that is integrative of the sensual, the rational, because when there's a component of poetry that is rational, like we see this even in something like a haiku, which has I think a 575, or is it 353? I can't remember exactly, but like there is a measurable like component to that, and then also something that is spiritual. So it's almost like he was describing with sensuous, like this kind of mind, body, spirit all integrated into one. And that is definitely how I am using it. I mean, maybe the closest synonym to my book title could have been holistic knowledge. Something that is just bringing in the whole and making knowledge. I wanted a term that makes knowledge almost, going back to the Yoruba cosmology, makes knowledge a deity, but one that we can have a personal relationship with. Because in Euro-patriarchal knowledge, we think of knowledge as something that we accumulate, something that's very separate from us, and that we can also weaponize and use to discriminate others, and so on and so forth, or build successful careers with, or whatever. But we don't have this intimacy with knowledge, and so that's what the word sensuous in front of it is trying to evoke all of these elements.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I guess what was coming to me as I heard you speak too was, there does seem to be, and other folks have spoken about this, around this split in the, I don't know if we'll call it the Western civilization experiment, right? This distinction, often also through religion, of the split between mind and body, right? Or embodiment, and then a kind of desire to ascend, right? And descend and up and out, and maybe to the, the glory of a deity up in the sky. And, everything connected to the earth and the mother, and, that's all to be ascended, right? To rise above. And you can see that running right through to, Elon Musk's strong phallic desire to get to Mars, and, up and out, and let's get out of here. And again, the whole techno-utopian paradigm of the goal is actually to fully merge with computers and, release the body entirely and just exist in, a database of the metaverse, right? Like that sense of really this, I see it as this deep fear of the sensuous, right? The embodied, kind of carnal and yet truth of what it means to be both, right? To have an ability to observe, right? And I think of the term spectator or spectate, to look upon, right, as a way of knowing, and observe. And then there's the other one, like the inside through the body. And I think this is more too, I hear you saying, I think with sensuous knowledge, right, this way of knowing through embodiment and deep attunement and, listening and relationality, which also, again, has that component of to die and to dissolve again into everything. And there's a kind of like a tragic mirror in a way, right? That the dominant culture that seems to be kind of like the crystallization of the ego that wants to never die and exist forever, and again, and ascend and get out, right? And the consequence on the rest of life. My teacher, again, Stephen Jenkinson, he spent many time in hospice, but he had this other phrase that just comes to me now, which is, he said, what's the opposite of dying? Or what's the opposite of death, right? Or opposite of life, I should say. What's the opposite of life? And you say, well, it's actually not death. The opposite of life is not dying. Like the unwillingness to die is the opposite of life, right? It's the undoing of that great cycle of infinite return, right? And so I see in your work, I think as well, this call to come back into relationality, right? To knowledge, to the sensual truth of all things, and understand what intelligence is there that can guide us in new and important ways. Does that feel the terrain?
Yeah, no, that's very beautiful. Thanks for sharing all that. I think, totally. It takes me back to the boyarchy spirit that I think governs our world, because there is such a tremendous fear of death. And, it's like all our institutions, all the key political decisions that impact all of our lives in such tremendous ways, and, especially harmfully to people in parts of the world where they have even less say about the decisions that are made than we who live in the Western world, even though we are also, silenced if we're not part of this conglomerate, if you like. But yes, all of these decisions are in some ways so, the infantility of them is because there is such a denial of death. And I love what your teacher said, because I think that's absolutely, I mean, I can't remember who, I'm sure that I'm paraphrasing someone, but like learning how to live is learning how to die, I think, to such a great extent. And, and noticing that the body is in a process of dying eventually, as is everything else that is a part of nature. And I think actually it goes to the core of the denial of death is the denial that we are a part of nature. Because if we were to appreciate that fully, then just as everything else in nature, we too will die. There's an ephemeral nature to our existence. So yeah, transcendence is certainly in some ways exciting, but to shape an entire philosophy around the idea that we must transcend this reality not only like creates so much harm, but it also fundamentally, I think, misunderstands transcendence, because we have there are so many opportunities and ways to transcend in a more like grounded, earthly way. In fact, I would say that all real transcendence happens when we are in our bodies. When we are struck by a beautiful natural scene, or when we fall in love, or when we expand our minds through this kind of intimate sensuous knowledge. Like, these are the true moments of transcendence. Everything else is speculation. Like, we probably are not going to go to Mars tomorrow, and when we do, so many people might die, and and that's not transcendence. That's just people who seem to loathe their own lives, trying to escape them.
Well, it feels like flight. That's why I hear. Yeah, it feels like flight from this very invitation, I think, to come back to life. Exactly. And we're just about complete now. And again, such a lovely conversation. Minna, I really appreciate the time. And again, I know your book's coming out very soon, but anything you want to speak about that, or how folks can connect with you?
I really enjoyed this conversation too. And thank you so much, Ian. And thanks to everyone who's here. And you can find me on, I guess I'm predominantly on Instagram these days, and just search for my name and you'll find me there.
Amazing. And the new book that's coming out?
The new book is called Can Feminism Be African? And it will be published by HarperCollins. It comes out on the 13th of February in the UK only, but I believe that you can order it elsewhere. It just might take a bit longer. So you can buy it wherever you buy books.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Minna. Again, appreciate your time.
Have a beautiful rest of the day, and thanks again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Mythic Masculine. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and share on your social media. Once again, you're also invited to find The Mythic Masculine on Substack. You'll be able to subscribe to forthcoming episodes, as well as become a paid supporter. Visit themythicmasculine.com to learn more.